Dumpster Fire Presidency and the dumbest bill in America. This is Mark Fisher with Mark and the Millennials. And the millennial joining me today is, of course, Christopher Hopkins, our producer. And this podcast is called Dumpster Fire Presidency. This is the presidency that is literally on full-blown meltdown. As you know, in past podcasts, we've had a dumpster fire segment. And this particular podcast, the whole podcast is about the dumpster fire presidency of Joe Biden. But also, we have a segment in this podcast about the vice president of the United States and how incredibly incompetent she is. And we'll talk about that more as we go along. But first up, Biden's press conference dumpster fire. You may or may not have seen his press conference, which occurred just a couple of days ago. But as recently as yesterday and even today, the Biden administration, via Jen Psaki and others, are coming out on TV and trying to clean up and clarify Biden's comments on the Ukraine and on the 2022 election, among other things. And so in the Daily Caller, the White House spent a portion of Wednesday evening and Thursday evening, okay, today is Friday, this happened just yesterday, cleaning up two key comments from President Joe Biden's press conference. Marathon formal press conference that he had lasted for 2 hours, which of course is, by the way, ridiculous. A good president has many press conferences, but they are strategic and they are short and they are focused on the key issues of the day. That's not what Biden did. And that's because he can't do very many press conferences. So I'm sure they gave him a lot of meds to make sure that he was awake for the 2 hours and, cognizant of what was going on. So Biden was beating out both former President Donald Trump and former President Barack Obama's lengthiest press conferences. So his was the longest, Biden's. While Biden started off by calling on reporters using a list in hand, he eventually abandoned his notes, his cliff notes, joking at one point that he could still stand despite the length of the event. With the lengthy press conference, a rare event for the current president, because he doesn't usually have press conferences, came many missteps. Early on, Biden was asked about the passage of his election bills and whether he believes the upcoming midterm election would be fair without them. Biden is pushing for passage of the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, as if, of course, you can't vote, which would give more federal control over state election laws. Republicans have blocked these efforts, often arguing it subverts the Constitution, which of course it does. Quote, "It all depends on whether or not we're able to make the case to the American people that some of this is being set up to try and alter the outcome of the election," Biden responded on Wednesday. And it's one thing, look, maybe I'm just being too much of an optimist. Remember how we thought that not too many people were going to show up to vote in the middle of a pandemic. We had the highest voter turnout in the history of the United States. That's because they didn't show up to vote during the pandemic. They were mailed ballots, Joe. And in Pennsylvania, many of them arrived en masse in all kinds of places, but we won't go there for the moment. Biden continued on to say that no matter how hard they, speaking of the Republicans, make it for minorities to vote, people will still stand in line and defy the attempt to keep them from voting. When asked for clarification later on in the press conference, Biden maintained that the 2022 midterm elections could easily be illegitimate. Podcast listeners, a president of the United States is saying the 22 midterm elections, that is the midterm elections that will happen this year in November, could easily be illegitimate. Quote, "Oh yeah, I think it could easily be illegitimate, Biden said. Imagine if, in fact, Trump is succeeded in convincing to not count the votes, Biden said. Imagine if those attempts to say that the court was not legit, you have to recount it and we're going to discard the following votes. I'm not saying it's going to be legit. The increase in the prospect of being illegitimate is a direct proportion to us not being able to get these reforms passed. So he's saying the Republicans are going to cheat nationwide unless there is a federal takeover of the elections by the Democrats, which prohibit the use of voter ID, among other things. Biden's election comments and the subsequent media coverage sparked pushback from the White House press secretary Jen Psaki on Thursday morning. First, Psaki tweeted that Biden was not casting doubt on the legitimacy of the 2022 election and was, in fact, making the opposite point. But, folks, that's not what he said. Biden again said the 2022 midterm elections could easily be illegitimate, and then repeated himself and said it again. Quote, in 2020, a record number of voters turned out in the face of a pandemic, and election officials made sure they could vote and they have the votes counted, Psaki tweeted. He was explaining that the results would be illegitimate if states do what the former president asked them to do after the 2020 election: toss out ballots and overturn results after the fact. The big lie is putting our democracy at risk. We're fighting to protect it. So she kind of doubled down on the Biden point, said, well, that's not what he meant, but that's actually what she meant. Shortly afterwards, Psaki went on Fox News, where she addressed the president's comments for a second time. Psaki said by the way, she must have been really hard up to go on Fox News, right? Because Psaki never comes on Fox News willingly. The only person that she actually has to face in Fox News is Peter Doocy, who asks her questions, but otherwise she does not come on Fox News. So for Psaki to come on Fox News, podcast listeners, it must have been really bad for the Biden administration after that press conference. So she comes on Fox News, where she addressed the president's comments for a second time. Psaki said she talked to the president a lot about this, and he is absolutely not predicting that the 2022 elections would be illegitimate. Quote, the point he was raising was both that in 2020, even amongst challenging circumstances, efforts to suppress the vote in the midst of a pandemic, there was record turnout, Psaki said. Democrats and Republicans, record turnout to go to the polls. The point he was making is that the former president asked a number of states, 7 or more, in fact, to overturn the outcome of the election, as she was referring to Donald Trump. The press secretary continued addressing Biden's illegitimate elections comments during Thursday's afternoon's press briefing, that was yesterday. She reiterated that Biden was not intending to cast doubt on the legitimacy of the 2022 election, and continued on to argue that he was actually attempting to make the opposite point. So this continues, and there are tweets and so forth in this Daily Caller article. It's just unbelievable when you read this nonsense. And also, if you actually had an opportunity to listen to the Biden press conference, not that this is something that you would actually want to do, you would hear all of these crazy things that he's saying and how desperate a party that has no ideas, that has no real compass, that has no moral focus, no moral base, no legitimacy for governing, because they don't really believe in anything. They just believe in power, how they're willing to do anything to keep it, even though they know that in November they're going to get shellacked. And so then in the New York Post, Biden lashes out at reporters' stupid question after a Ukraine gaffe. So President Biden lashed out Thursday at a reporter for what he called a stupid question about Russia potentially invading Ukraine, as the White House scrambled to clean up Biden's Wednesday gaffe. That Russia may actually face less blowback for a minor incursion. Imagine that, a minor incursion. I mean, what is that? It's like, oh, the Chinese had a minor incursion into the United States mainland today. Imagine if you're in the Ukraine and you hear the president of the United States saying, well, the Russians can have a minor incursion. They just can have a major incursion. So they can, kill like 500,000 people, but as long as it's not like a couple of million. As reporters were escorted out of a science-focused meeting next door to the White House, Fox News correspondent Jacques Heinrich shouted, Why are you waiting on Russian President Putin to make the first move, sir? Biden's answer was not captured on official video live stream, but press audio engineers recorded him saying, "What a stupid question," according to a poll report by Yahoo's Alexander Nazarian. Video emerged later showing Biden chuckling and giving a disbelieving look to officials before muttering the jab. In other words, he's not even taking it seriously. Biden and his aides tried repeatedly Thursday to walk back the minor incursion remark made during his 2-hour press conference as horrified Ukrainian officials warned that Putin may see it as a green light to invade. Of course he sees it as a green light to invade. Quote, "We want to remind the great powers that there are no minor incursions in small nations," Zelensky tweeted, "just as there are no minor casualties and little grief from the loss of loved ones. I say this as the president of a great power." At the press conference, Biden said, "I think that what you're going to see is that Russia will be held accountable if it invades." How? And it depends on what it does. It's one thing if it's a minor incursion, said Biden, and then we end up having a fight about what to do and what not to do, etc. But the president told reporters Thursday in the Oval Office that let there be no doubt at all that if Putin makes his choice, Russia will pay a heavy price. Folks, podcast listeners, I have to stop here because imagine if a President Trump said the same thing. Remember the entire Trump presidency? Trump is a Putin spy. Trump is a Russian plant. Trump has colluded with Russia. Imagine if Russia was doing the same thing during the Trump administration, namely trying to invade the Ukraine, potentially invading the Ukraine. And Trump said, the country doesn't really matter. It's a minor incursion. I mean, who cares? The media would just have gone crazy. They would have gone crazy. But I think any reasonable person, at least in this particular case, I'm not saying that Trump didn't make plenty of mistakes because he did, but in this particular case, I don't think Vladimir Putin would actually have invaded or even threatened to have invaded Ukraine during a Trump presidency. I don't think Putin is afraid of Biden. I most definitely think he was very afraid of the uncertainty of the Trump administration's foreign policy, namely that they would react, that they would respond. Quote, this is back to the article, quote, "I've been absolutely clear with President Putin," Biden added. "He has no misunderstanding. If any assembled Russian units move across the Ukrainian border, that is an invasion." So Biden, of course, cleared up what he said. Biden lashed out at Heinrich at a subsequent meeting of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology in the White House adjacent Eisenhower Executive Office building. The U.S. and its European allies say Putin has massed up to 100,000 troops near Ukraine's borders. Last week, the White House alleged Russia may stage a false flag attack on its own forces to provide a justification for war. Yeah, like a false flag attack. It sounds like something the FBI did on January 6th. When Biden was vice president in 2014, Russia invaded and annexed Crimea from Ukraine following a disputed referendum. Putin's government also allegedly supports a pair of pro-Russian breakaway states in eastern Ukraine. So podcast listeners, Russia has always been a bully. Always. Communist Russia was a bully, and Russia is a bully today. Obviously, Tsarist Russia was a bully. This is what they do. This is what they do, and they will continue to do so unless there is pushback. And why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't they try now with this particular president? A president who's trying to cancel natural gas, trying to cancel natural gas exports from the United States to Europe, literally. And you have Putin, who's emboldened by going, oh, great, we will take that money then. we will build natural gas pipelines and we will be able to produce natural gas and provide that natural gas to Eastern and Western Europe. And so why wouldn't Putin think, well, we can do the same thing in Ukraine. We can just take over this additional territory and the natural resources, because we have a president that clearly does not care. He doesn't care. Why should he? And so it's not just a dumpster fire presidency. It's a dumpster fire vice presidency. Queen Harris gets testy. So Kamala Harris is questioned about the voting rights legislation. And she gets all testy to an NBC anchor and says it's astonishing Biden's doubting U.S. elections. That's what the NBC anchor says. It's like, what the heck? Why would Joe Biden say that the elections are not going to be fair moving forward if you don't pass this legislation? So Vice President Kamala Harris sparred with Today anchor Savannah Guthrie Thursday morning when asked about President Biden casting doubt on the legitimacy of the 2022 midterm elections. So first, podcast listeners, you heard me speak about Biden's stupid comments about the voting rights legislation, that the 2022 elections wouldn't be legitimate. And then Kamala is now out there on the Today Show, and she's being interviewed. And during the interview with Kamala and Guthrie, Kamala gets very testy. And you'll love the way she tries to divert attention away from this. We have a series of clips on this, just 3. And believe me, they all build on one another. They're from the same interview. They are epic to listen to this, because that's when you will come to the conclusion how incredibly stupid she is, how incredibly out of control this administration is, and what just a complete dumpster fire it is. First up, we have a clip with Savannah Guthrie interviewing Kamala Harris. Here it is.
Let's talk about another comment the president made. He openly cast doubt on whether the 2022 midterm elections would be legitimate. He said it all depends, which is astonishing to hear a president question whether our elections will be legitimate. We've heard it before, but not from this president. Is he really concerned that we may not have fair and free elections?
The president has been consistent on this issue. And the issue at hand, I was there last night in the chamber of the Senate, and the issue is that there are 2 bills, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the Freedom to Vote Act, that have been the solution that has been offered to address the fact that around our country, states have put in place laws that are purposely making it more difficult for the American people to vote. Laws which will be felt by at least 55 million Americans, regardless of their party affiliation, their race, their gender, or their geographic location.
Ah, yes. Laws that are being put into place by certain states to stop, illegals from voting. That's really what she's saying. You have to always read between the lines when Democrats talk about voting rights legislation, because they know they need to gin up their base and make people think that they're being denied the opportunity to vote. And also, at the same time, the true goal is to eliminate any kinds of checks and balances in the voting process to make sure that people who are not citizens can vote, or people who are not residents of that state can vote as well. It's really what she's talking about. And so here is Savannah Guthrie from NBC News, really hitting Kamala and following up with her question about, well, that's not really what I asked you. What I asked you is, do you think the 2022 election is going to be illegitimate? Can you please answer that? And if so, why? How? Here's the clip.
To the point, though, because those bills were debated. The bills were debated and they didn't pass.
If I may finish.
But the specific question, if you don't mind, does he think, now that these bills haven't been passed, that the 22 midterms won't be legitimate or fair or free?
Let's not conflate issues. So what we are looking at, and the topic of so much debate last night, was that we as America cannot afford to allow this blatant erosion of our democracy, and in particular, the right of all Americans who are eligible to vote to have access to the ballot unfettered. That is the topic of the conversation, and let's not be distracted by the political gamesmanship when what is truly at stake are issues like whether Americans with disability have the opportunity to vote by mail, whether a single parent has the opportunity with 3 kids in the back seat to vote by dropping off their ballot in a drop box instead of having to stand in line with those 3 kids for hours. These are the issues that are at stake.
So, podcast listeners, complete and utter lies. The Americans with Disabilities Act requires reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities. That includes voting. That includes the workplace. Those protections have been enshrined in law for many years, not just at the federal level, but at the state level. And you can indeed vote absentee in the states. In addition to that, she mentions that you can't vote, of course, as a parent. It's just too difficult because you've got kids in the back seat of the car. And when you vote, you need to drop your ballots in a drop box. Podcast listeners, a drop box? A drop box? I mean, that's the whole point of why the Democrats are what they're trying to do here is to cheat, obviously, because if we said to you before, a drop box isn't a person. So if you vote, no matter who you are, there's no reason why you can't just hand that ballot that you got by mail to the person in the state's registrar's office or your county registrar's office, the State Board of Elections. You can just go there and hand it to them, or you can put it in the mailbox. But that's not what they want. Democrats want these drop boxes in every single little community, no matter where it is. And by little community, I mean big communities, small communities. And they want to do that because it does what? It makes it so much easier to ballot harvest. We've talked about this many times. And the thing is, I'm shocked that Savannah Guthrie and the rest of the mainstream media won't follow up on that, which is to walk the American people through why drop boxes are problematic and say, aren't you concerned that someone could go door to door and give everybody in a community that has historically not voted $10 to get their ballot that was mailed to them, which is what Democrats want, mass mail-out balloting and mass mail-in balloting, and then collect those ballots and then mark them and then drop them in a drop box, drop hundreds of them, if not thousands of them, in a drop box. And that would be a question to ask, because this is indeed happening in states that have mass mail-out balloting as well as drop boxes. Those two things combined cause a problem, obviously. So Kamala Harris, in this same interview, comes up with a diversion, the ultimate diversion, foreign policy. Remember, podcast listeners, she's asked about Biden's comments that the 2022 elections will be illegitimate. And she realizes she can't articulate a response because she's lied, and none of the lies seem to be working in the interview because they're all so stupid and any reasonable person wouldn't believe them. And so she decides to change the subject with a diversion and then go to the whole foreign policy thing. We have that clip, and here it is.
And the president laid a lot of
and pivotal issues in terms of our democracy. We had an extensive conversation about foreign policy, Savannah.
Yeah,
well, I've met with prime ministers and presidents from around the globe, both partners and allies of ours. They are asking, what is going on with voting rights in America? Because they look to us as a role model of what it means to be a democracy. And they are monitoring to wonder and question whether there is an erosion of our democracy and therefore an erosion of one of the best role models of what a democracy does and can do.
Yeah, so there's Kamala going right from, voting rights to foreign policy and saying that when she goes and meets foreign leaders, the leaders are commenting, well, what's up with your elections, Kamala, in the United States? They obviously aren't fair because the president of the United States is saying that your elections are illegitimate. By the way, Hillary Clinton said the same thing when she lost. And Donald Trump said the same thing as well. So now we have a series of presidents and a series of politicians. Now it's the entire Democrat Party in Congress and the president and the vice president who are all saying that we don't have free and fair elections today. And now you have individuals who lead countries across the world who are saying, wait a minute, you are the world's model for democracy. And your leaders at the very highest level are saying elections aren't fair in the United States, that people are being stopped from voting, that votes aren't being counted. And so what do you think that does? What do you think that does to the rest of the world? They believe that we are losing legitimacy. And if we had, here's the point, if we had a president and if we had a vice president and if we had honest discussions at the federal level and at the state level, we would all agree, if we were really honest, we would agree on some basic principles about voting. Vote in person, unless you can't. Show an ID, and that is compulsory. It's not a show an ID unless you can. It's no, you got to show an ID. That's just the way it is. And then the other thing is no drop boxes. And the reason why you don't have drop boxes is because you would also at the same time prohibit ballot harvesting nationwide. You would prohibit it. And that would be on a state-by-state basis, of course, because the states can run their elections. But here's the point. If we had an honest discussion, those are the things that we would agree on. Here's another thing that we could potentially agree on. 2 weeks of early voting. Here's another thing that we should agree on. When you do request a ballot by mail, the ballot must be postmarked. Okay? Must be postmarked by the day of the election. Why do you think they want drop boxes? Because there's no postmark on the ballots. That's why. Do you really think, podcast listeners, if you're in a county with 1 million people, as an example, and you have 150 drop boxes, that the folks who run the elections are going to be able to get the trucks to all those drop boxes by the close of the election day? Let's say the elections end on election day at 8 p.m. Do you think all those drop boxes will be picked up by 8 p.m.? No, of course not. It's going to take them a day or two to get them all. And as they do, people can continue to vote post-election. No one ever talks about this. And because they don't want to walk you through this. The media doesn't want to walk you through this whatsoever because I actually don't think they know. I know this is, I don't think the mainstream media even knows that this is happening or that it is a possibility. The fact that it's a possibility means that it shouldn't be permitted. And so we have foreign leaders who are probably rightfully asking questions, but not necessarily knowing the details, saying, what's going on in the United States of America, Kamala? Your elections aren't, they don't seem to be fair because that's all you guys in the Democrat Party talk about. And of course, the fact of the matter is the Democrat Party wants to water down the ability of the states and the local governments to be able to have checks and balances in place to stop cheating. They want to eliminate that. And Kamala, of course, never did answer the question, which was, do you believe the 2022 midterm elections in November will be illegitimate? And naturally, she can't answer that question. Case in point about what the Democrats are up to. Podcast listeners, in North Carolina, there's a sitting congressman. His name's Madison Cawthorn. He is wheelchair bound. He's very young. And there is a suit that has been filed to disqualify him from running for re-election. So a group of 11 North Carolina voters filed a legal challenge to disqualify Representative, he's a congressman, Madison Cawthorn from running for a second term, arguing his involvement in a rally preceding the January 6, 2021 riot on Capitol Hill constitutionally bars him from waging another campaign. Folks, Madison Cawthorn is a young guy. He had, I believe, an accident years ago. I don't recall how it happened, but he is indeed wheelchair bound, right? He can't walk. And apparently, Madison Cawthorn, a member of the United States House of Representatives from North Carolina, is so dangerous in that wheelchair that they thought that he was going to, as a sitting member of Congress, try to overthrow the United States government as a sitting member of Congress during the riot on Capitol Hill, and that he should be barred from actually waging another campaign. Lawyers for the 11 voters filed the suit to the State Board of Elections, contending that Cawthorn's comments in the speech shortly preceding the insurrection violate the 14th Amendment, which states in part that no person who, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same. Folks, Madison Cawthorn was not trying to break into the Capitol on his wheelchair. It didn't happen. The suit goes on to claim that the mob that stormed the Capitol last year in an unsuccessful attempt to halt the certification of the 2020 presidential race amounted to an insurrection. So who do you think is actually trying to stop Madison Cawthorn from running? The left. So you have Kamala Harris talking about voting rights and how, and President Biden and how the 2022 elections are going to be illegitimate. And at the same time, the Democrats are trying to stop Madison Cawthorn from running for re-election because he was in the audience listening to President Donald Trump speak on January 6th. And as a result of listening to the free speech of someone, he should somehow be disqualified from running. Jamie Raskin, congressman from Montgomery County, Maryland, wants to do the same thing. Jamie Raskin wants to prohibit Donald Trump from ever running for re-election again. Who do you think's cheating, folks? Who do you think's cheating? And then you have Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona, who's being, by the way, opposed by Blake Masters in Arizona. Blake Masters is running for the United States Senate against sitting Senator Mark Kelly. Senator Mark Kelly, from a state that clearly is a red state, but Senator Mark Kelly is a Democrat, votes to cancel the filibuster. Can you imagine? You're from a state that's a Republican state, and you don't believe that people should have to work together and have to actually think through legislation and compromise in the Senate so that you really work through the legislation. No, he doesn't think that at all. So Blake Masters is running against him, thankfully, and I think this is a seat that's definitely going to go to Blake Masters. He's kind of a tech guru, and he also did something that's really unique. He auctioned off some NFTs of the book that he wrote a foreword to. The book's called 0 to 1. And Blake Masters auctioned off some NFTs of the original copies of 0 to 1 and raised, I think, over $500,000 in doing so. Very techie, very unique and so forth. Also very much appeals to millennials. But you see, podcast listeners, where this is all headed. You have a Democrat Party who's saying, on the one hand, we need to pass federal laws because the 2022 midterms are going to be stolen. And at the same time, they're trying to prevent a former sitting president from running for re-election or for running ever again. And at the same time, they're trying to prevent Madison Cawthorn from running for Congress again. And at the same time, they're trying to tell people that you shouldn't have to use voter ID. Just unbelievable. Unbelievable. So next up, podcast listeners, here's an interesting story. The IRS is employing facial recognition technology. Yeah. Biden's IRS will make users upload pictures of their faces to access tax information. What could go wrong there? It's in the Daily Wire. The IRS will soon make taxpayers upload a selfie for certain tax records. Yes, you heard that right. The IRS, starting in summer 2022, if you need to log in to the IRS's website to access the Child Tax Credit Update portal, get your tax transcript, or review a payment agreement with the agency, you will need to create an account with a third-party identity verification company called ID.me, reported by CNBC. A simple username and password will no longer suffice. You will need to provide a government document with a photo such as a driver's license, a state ID, or a passport, and take a video selfie with your smartphone or computer. An IRS spokesman told CNBC that taxpayers can still pay or file their taxes without submitting a selfie or other information to a third-party identity verification company by using bank accounts, credit cards, and similar means. However, CNBC again emphasized that doing the aforementioned basic things, as well as applying for payment plans and monitoring stimulus checks, will require facial identification. Last year, the Biden administration's IRS also drew ire for a plan that would have compelled banks to report gross account inflows and outflows to the IRS for transactions of $600 or more. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen brushed off concerns about the plan during an interview with CNBC. Quote, "Right now, on every bank account that earns more than $10 a year in interest, the banks report the interest to the IRS," she explained. That's part of the information base that includes W-2s and reports on dividends and other income taxes that taxpayers have earned, so collection of information is routine. It comes from places where the information on income is opaque and can be hidden, she added. And a simple way for the IRS to get a sense of where that might be is just a few pieces of information about an individual's bank accounts. Nothing at that transaction level would violate privacy, simply aggregate inflows into the account over a year and aggregate outflows. That would really help the IRS target their auditing resources. Podcast listeners, what do you think could potentially go wrong here? So here again, we have this classic dilemma in American history. You have a government agency saying, well, in order to make it more secure that someone doesn't hack your tax records and make them public, or try to hold you as an elected official or as somebody who works for one of the agencies or just your everyday citizen, to try to hold them hostage by threatening to release your tax returns. In order to make it more safe, we want facial recognition technology. So we have this classic dilemma again in American history in 2022, where you have a federal agency collecting even more data about you, including what you look like. And that is dangerous. Could it be more secure? I have no doubts. Let's be fair. It's probably a lot more secure that the IRS has your face, or that, if you have a Mac, ladies and gentlemen, a modern version of a Mac, you have facial recognition technology or facial recognition technology on your iPhone, or with a Mac, you can use your fingerprint. So people willingly do that all day long, and they willingly upload their face to other kinds of e-verification products. So it's understandable on the one hand that this would make it safer, but it's the fact that it's the government that is really concerning. I mean, you should be concerned about any tech company asking for this, by the way, but it's particularly concerning when it is the government that is involved in this, that is literally saying to you, that we want your facial recognition information. And then what's going to happen next? Well, probably they're going to share that information with other federal agencies. And then they know where you live. They know what you look like. They have your fingerprints. They have your eye scans, your face scans. They know everything about your bank account. There's nothing anymore that's truly private, even though they say, oh, it's to protect your privacy. Given the direction of the United States of America in the 21st century, I'm not buying it. Just not. And so in Gizmodo, same article, IRS will require facial recognition scans to access your taxes online. Online tax filers in the U.S. will soon be required to submit a selfie to a third-party identification verification company using facial recognition tech in order to access their IRS accounts. And that's starting this summer of 2022. And I think I have a problem with this because we're told, oh, it's so much easier to upload your tax filings to the IRS. I think that's true. Certainly easier than mailing it. It's certainly faster, certainly cheaper. You don't have to pay for the postage. However, these conveniences have come with very, very dangerous consequences or potential consequences, because the same federal government that is telling you that, you shouldn't have the right to run for election because of who you voted for, what can they possibly do to you? Well, they've got all this information. Who knows what the next thing is? And we can only imagine what that could turn into. So I don't know. I have a problem with this. I know, and I understand the convenience factor. I understand that this probably implements more safety features, that you are the only person that can access your records. But the fact that it's the government that is storing this information, even though they're using a third-party vendor, is very, very concerning. So next up, podcast listeners, we have Go Woke or Go Broke. M&Ms, M&Ms, the little things that you eat that are chocolate and they're candy coated, right? Those M&Ms. The M&M characters are becoming inclusive. And that's a good Go Woke or Go Broke. The beloved M&M characters, you see them on TV and they're kind of alive, and it's a big fat M&M and it's got the arms outside of the candy coating and the eyes and all that stuff. The beloved M&M characters are becoming more inclusive with several changes that are subtle but not noticeable. Mars Wrigley, which owns M&Ms, announced on Thursday a global commitment to creating a world where everyone feels they belong and society is inclusive. The green M&M character will lose her peach-colored legs and stiletto boots in favor of white legs and sneakers after criticism that the character was sexualized. Jeez, that's so stupid. Wouldn't it make more sense if the green M&M, which currently has peach-colored legs and stiletto boots, also had a big bulge, right where it counts, so that would be like a transgender? I mean, why don't they just do that? I mean, clearly that's where this is headed. Mars, which owns M&Ms, said it wanted the green M&M to be better represented, to reflect confidence and empowerment as a strong female and known for much more than her boots. I know plenty of strong females that wear boots. I do. My wife is one of them. So, that's a fact. But this just goes to show you what these idiots think of women, right? They don't really think of women as being able to have a character of strength. To them, it's only the way they look. Once again, classic left, right? They judge people by the way they look, not by the content of their character. That is the new left. The brown M&M will have her heels lowered to a professional height. In a Q&A on the company's website for each character, her character says she is not bossy. She's just the boss. Jeez. Meanwhile, the green and brown M&Ms will no longer have a rivalry, but will now be together, throwing shine and not shade. The anxious orange M&M, who Mars says is one of the most relatable characters with Gen Z, the most anxious generation, previously had his shoes untied, but will now have them tied. The red M&M, an outspoken character, sometimes interpreted as bullying the other M&Ms, will start being more kind to his fellow candy characters. The new versions of the characters will roll out online this week and will start appearing on M&M's packaging later this year. The changes are meant to increase a sense of belonging for the 10 million people around the world by 2025. For 10 million people, not the 10 million people, just so you know, it says for the 10 million people around the world by 2025, according to Mars. M&M's has long been committed to creating colorful fun for all, and this purpose serves as a more concrete commitment to what we've always believed as a brand, that everyone has the right to enjoy moments of happiness and fun is the most powerful way to help people feel that they belong, said Catherine Slight. Her last name is Slight. That's funny. Mars Wrigley's chief growth officer. So, in response to this, the Babylon Bee, the satirical site, has an article titled M&M's introduces new trans character who identifies as a Skittle. U.S., as part of a bold new marketing strategy to promote inclusivity and appeal to less than 1% of the population, Mars Incorporated has introduced a new M&M character who identifies as a Skittle. Quote, I'm going to be honest here. We basically are doing this because it's hip and makes us look cool, said Mars Incorporated CEO Franklin Crunchy. And that adds to the bottom line. I think we can make a decent fortune by comparing the hardship of real trans people to a wacky cartoon character. That's really going to make a difference. Yes. So once again, podcast listeners, we have Mars, which owns M&M's, and you have those M&M's characters. And the teaching moment from Mars to the citizens of the world is that no matter how you look, you shouldn't be judged by that. Oh, no, it's actually the opposite. What they're saying is it only matters how you look, which is why they're getting to this go wokeness PC business. It only matters the way you look. It doesn't matter that you may think in a different way or that you may disagree with people. Your character doesn't matter, just the way you look. Incredible. And that's Go Woke or Go Broke. And next up, podcast listeners, we have the dumbest bill in America. And do we have a lead up, Mr. Producer? Here it is.
Dum 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 dum.
And it's the dumbest bill in America, and it is vaccination without consent. That's right, vaccination without consent, and that is of children. Senate Bill 866, State Senate bill in California by Senator Scott Wiener, appropriately named Scott Wiener. We've had Scott Wiener before as the dumbest bill, and he keeps giving more dumbest bills all the time. Senate Bill 866 would let children over 12 get vaccines without parental consent. Without parental consent. That is right. All vaccines, but specifically, naturally, it's extended to COVID vaccines. A new bill, this is in Newsweek, hardly a right-wing magazine. A new bill has been tabled in California that, if passed, would allow children aged 12 or older to receive COVID-19 vaccines without the permission of their parents. Currently in California, minors aged 12 to 17 cannot receive a COVID-19 vaccine without parental consent. However, there are some exceptions. In San Francisco County, those 12 or older can consent as long as the healthcare provider reasonably attempts to notify their guardian and allow them the opportunity to object. That's a distinction without a difference, right? Oh, wait a minute. Son, come on in. I'm going to give you this. Oh, let me try calling your parents first. What's the number again? Oh, sorry. I got the voicemail. I tried. Here's the jab. In California, minors do not need parental consent to get the human papillomavirus, HPV, that's how you say it, the HPV or hepatitis B vaccines. Again, in California, a minor already doesn't need consent to get the HPV or hepatitis B vaccines. Can you imagine? No parental consent. And so, State Senator Scott Wiener, very appropriately named from San Francisco, put Senate Bill 866 in, and Richard Pan, Democrat of Sacramento, co-sponsored it. If passed, the bill would allow vaccine providers to give doses to children 12 and over without permission from their guardians. Under the new law, it would not be a legal requirement for parents to even know that their child has received the vaccine. So what could go wrong there? When you take your child to get a vaccine, let's just say, and your child gets the vaccine the second time because your child doesn't tell you because they don't want you to know, or for whatever reason they don't tell you, who knows, they're kids, that they already got the vaccine itself, not the booster, but the vaccine. So now they have two vaccines. What could possibly go wrong? Oh, nothing at all. Way to go, Senator Scott Wiener. Speaking of which, KPIX, CBS in San Francisco, the local CBS affiliate in San Francisco, interviewed Senator Scott Wiener, and this was in 2019. Remember, in mid-2019, when this interview occurred, we did not have COVID. But Scott Wiener was already talking about vaccinations without parental consent in California. He was already talking about it in 2019. Sure makes you wonder, right? Well, we have a clip of this, and here it is.
Right. So this bill, a few years ago, the legislature said you have to vaccinate your kids unless there's a medical reason not to. We then started seeing a small number of very unethical doctors who started selling fraudulent medical exemptions. And what the legislation does is it requires a sign-off from the Department of Public Health to say this kid actually has a legitimate medical exemption. So kids who need an exemption will get it.
Change that.
So that's Scott Wiener in mid-2019, prior to COVID, no one even knew what COVID was, talking about how bad doctors were faking vaccine cards. This is before COVID. And faking them for children because the parents didn't want their kids to get other kinds of forced vaccinations or what have you. You know, that's a whole different argument. But nonetheless, he's talking about that and saying the doctors are bad because the doctors are faking it. Meanwhile, he wants to allow children to get these vaccinations without any kind of parental consent. And this is the same guy that keeps putting in crazy bills. So the bill would lift the parental requirement for the age group, as mentioned, 12 and older, for any vaccine that has been approved by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which includes, of course, the COVID-19 vaccine. In the United States, the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine is the only inoculation that's been approved for 12 to 17-year-olds. Oh, what a surprise. We should call him Scott Pfizer Wiener. Vaccine consent laws vary across the country. Why they do, I have no idea, by the way. For example, Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia allow children aged 11 and older to be inoculated without their parents' consent. Idiocy. Alabama's age is 14. Oregon is 15. And Rhode Island and South Carolina set it at 16. I actually don't know that that's true. Because remember, this is Newsweek. So I'm not really sure I believe anything Newsweek says. But here's the thing, podcast listeners. In America, we have this thing called informed consent. In fact, we did an entire podcast on the term informed consent, which means that you must be completely and utterly informed about a medical decision, whether it's a shot or whether it's a procedure. And the idea is you get fully informed so that you can make a cognizant and good decision about your health. Children can't do that. That's why they have parents. That's why we call them children to begin with. And this guy, State Senator Scott Wiener, the bills he puts in, they're obsessed with children. Obsessed. I mean, this guy is sick. He even believes in like the whole man-boy love thing. So this tells you everything you need to know about this idiot in California, the appropriately named State Senator Scott Wiener. And podcast listeners, I want you to know this. I actually pull the bills up and read them. So this Senate Bill 866, as introduced, what I read is so that a minor 12 years of age or older, this is from the bill itself, may consent to a vaccine that is approved by the United States Food and Drug Administration and meets the recommendations of the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices of the Federal Centers for Disease Control and Prevention without the consent of parent or guardian of the minor. That is directly from the bill. We don't just read articles about these bills to you, we actually read the bills. And so here you have it. You have a sitting state senator in California that was talking about vaccines in 2019 and making sure that children as young as 12 could get those vaccines without parental consent. And now he has a bill in 2022, because this bill is from this month, January 2022, in the California state legislature that extends that to COVID-19 vaccines. And you as the parent would never know that your child got this shot. Never know. It's unbelievable. It's disgusting. It shows you the erosion of parental rights in California. And it demonstrates to me how we need to take back this country and how anyone remains a resident of California at this particular point in time. I have no idea. But hopefully, if enough people move out of California, the state will finally get the message that things need to change. Not sure else how to do it. I really don't. I'm not really sure. And that's the dumbest bill in America, vaccination of children without consent. And that's it for Mark and the Millennials. Thank you for joining Mark and the Millennials. This is Mark Fisher. Thank you to our producer, Christopher Hopkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Parler, Rumble, and our website. See you next time.